global market insights, local market intel, expert opinion. The condiments that spice up the recipe of the success of your business. And here in Bisnomics, that's exactly what we deliver to you. I'm Tharindu Amarasekara. Welcome to your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. The education market. Well, one would definitely remember it as one of those industries that faced tremendous transformation due to the pandemic. And one aspect of this that really came to the forefront was the Edtech market. How well did technology blend in to the education system in Sri Lanka and globally, and how well did the Edtech segment help the education industry to keep flourishing in the face of a global pandemic? This will be our focus today in Bisnomics. And joining me for this discussion is an expert in the field of Edtech, who is none other than Chaminda Silva. Chaminda, welcome to Bisnomics.
Thank you, Tharindu. It's my pleasure to be here.
Chaminda, the numbers when it comes to Edtech seem simply, I would say, outstanding. You're looking at a growth of more than 15% over the next few years. You're looking at a global market opportunity of close to $500 billion. Now, you are looking at a world that even in some of the most developed countries was initially extremely traditional. Go to the classroom, learn. I don't think the education or the teaching methodology has changed globally for a long time. But in comes the pandemic, and almost over a weekend, we saw this industry getting transformed. Now, you are at the forefront of the action. You probably had a front row seat to the action, and you know better about it than I do. Enlighten us. What exactly is Edtech, and what's the scope of it?
Thank you, Tharindu. So, in its simplest form, I'll start with the plain vanilla definition.
Please do. We love that.
The definition is basically it's technology that facilitates learning for its key stakeholders. Now, let's start delving in. Who are the key stakeholders? Number one, the schools or the administrators. Number two, the educators or the teachers. I'm using these terms interchangeably.
For sure.
The students and the parents, right? So these are the key stakeholders that forms this whole ecosystem. Now, ideally, in an Edtech system, you want it to drive inclusivity, number one, and then number two, efficiencies, which includes cost efficiencies as well over a period of time. It's not going to happen overnight.
Correct.
But you're spot on. The pandemic was a game changer. It was, I would put it more as a catalyst. Now, staying with that, within the industry, there are few subsectors which saw perhaps more of the kicker than others in Sri Lanka as well as globally. So I'll just touch on those.
Sure.
We can go into detail as we go through
Absolutely.
the discussion, Tharindu. So number one, the learning management systems, the LMS, right? The e-learning part of it. Number two, educational content. Right? I mean, content played a massive role, and it will continue to play a massive role. Then digital communication, okay? Then admin management systems, right? And the newest addition was the data processing or the data analytics, because now suddenly you have schools who have been storing data of children, which was not there historically. And also, the other positive thing that came out was fintech, which is a whole different sector by itself. There was a overlay with fintech as well for, say, school fee payments, right? And then also related segments for education on e-commerce, such as, in the simplest form, an online bookstore, right? So, I'd like to take a step back, Tharindu. Now, the technology, particularly for this segment, it's important for me to emphasize this. The whole platforms, the people who create these platforms, has to appreciate the fact that our teachers, globally and particularly in Sri Lanka, in developing nations. When I say Sri Lanka, I mean developing nations, are good at teaching. They're experts at teaching, right? All of us are a product of that, right? So whatever technology platform that you come up with for education has to be aligned to the educators. It has to make the role of an educator easier and more productive. Now, if it is so sophisticated, if it is too sophisticated, it might even become a burden.
Correct.
So, this is something I think which we have learned over the pandemic, the last 12 to 14 months, Tarindu.
So you are saying that people were, especially in Sri Lanka, the teachers and the students were quite agile in adapting to that?
I think it works both ways.
Okay.
Right. One part of it was some of the platforms which are out there are perhaps too sophisticated, and it is more catering towards the corporate segments, one part of it, but even within the education segment, Tarindu, it was the more tech savvy, schools of the, say, the Western
province.
Western hemisphere. Actually,
okay.
Right.
Yes.
I'm talking
from
about
a
global perspective,
yes.
And that too, it was mainly for what you call those K-12 classes, which is the advanced level equivalent of Sri Lanka, and the higher education institutions.
Correct.
So when it trickled down, right, there were multiple challenges, which I assume we'll talk about, throughout this discussion later on. But I think the teachers did a fantastic job, and I want to keep emphasizing that in Sri Lanka, right, that they ensured that the disruption to education for our children was minimized.
Absolutely.
Not that it didn't go away,
yes,
but they did a fantastic job. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them.
Chaminda, let's talk about some numbers here, right? And that, you being an industry veteran and an expert, I'm sure you'll be able to enlighten us on this as well. Globally, how big is this market in terms of the users, the investments, and what kind of a future are we looking at? Because let's be honest, EdTech, in my opinion, especially in Asia and maybe in South Asia or maybe in developing countries, this was more at a research stage or like a complementary thing to the traditional classroom.
Yes.
In the bluntest of possible ways, a nice to have thing. Not that it was always used. Even the lecturers were not that motivated to use it before, and neither were the students. Students were happy to come and learn, lecturers were happy to come and teach, but the LMSs and the online platforms were more like a nice to have thing. In comes the pandemic, and all of a sudden it's not just anything, it's the only thing that is now there possible, making education and learning possible. So what kind of numbers are we looking at in this industry into the future?
Right. So before I start, I'd like to mention that the whole industry, even in its current avatar, is at a nascent stage, right? Still today,
despite all this adoption,
today it's in a nascent stage.
Despite 1 year of the pandemic,
it gave a massive kicker. It was a catalyst, right? And as you also rightfully mentioned, it was mainly the online learning and the LMS part of it that got a massive kicker.
Correct.
Right? But that is just a small part of a EdTech system. If you look at an ecosystem, it's a very vast system, as I mentioned.
What you're saying is we are still at the tip of the iceberg.
Tip of the iceberg. That's exactly what it is, right? So I'll come and touch on some numbers.
Sure.
But these numbers, Tarindu, are published numbers, and I have to tell you, these do not completely factor in the impact of the pandemic, because these are 2020 numbers.
Okay.
Right. So and these are numbers published earlier, like midway 2020. So at a global level, the size of the EdTech market is around $90 billion, right? And you're right. There are different estimates out there. You said 15%. I would think it will be around 20+%.
Even better.
Right, 20 to 20, even 25. Okay. Depending on where you're looking at. I'll touch a little bit about the developing nations in a bit. But the key thing that I want to emphasize here is that despite all of this, if you take the global spend on education, only 3% of that has been spent on education technology still. That's at a global level. But then obviously, one thing I have to tell you is that there's a lot of disparity between some of the developed nations and the developing nations, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it means that maybe we are doing something right in this part of the world, and our requirements are different, right? So coming to, I don't know whether I can call India a developing nation anymore. I don't think I can, but I'll just give you some numbers because the growth has been absolutely phenomenal, right? 1.3 billion people, about 490 million school population, which is students, including the tertiary education children. Despite all of that, despite the growth that they've seen, still the market size is about $3 billion. And during the next 5 years, the expectation is that it will grow 4x.
4 times, wow.
4x,
Massive.
right? Massive. And you know, all the big names, you know,
Yes.
the unicorns, right?
Are there.
Are there, right? So, I mean, again, that's a function of the sheer size of the country.
And that's another interesting trend what you're saying. Even some of these big companies, including some of the social media giants, as a CSR initiative or whatever, you call it what you want, but they are entering the edtech space step by step, because as you said, this is the future, the potential is massive. Chaminda, I want to ask you about the Sri Lanka situation. Due to COVID-19,
right,
what kind of a drive did we see towards edtech?
Right. Can I just go back?
Sure, yes, of course.
I just want to tell you a little bit about Africa. I'll come back to this, because we have interest in, as in, like, you know, we do some research on Africa as well. I won't spend a lot of time on this. So if you take whole of Africa, it's the size of India, I mean, the population wise,
yes,
right? So,
okay.
and again, the school going population is about 35%, but only about 5% of that has access to a quality edtech system. So the potential is enormous, even in that part of the world. So I thought that you
makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Would you mind repeating that second?
Yeah. The third question was, due to the pandemic, especially in Sri Lanka, what kind of a drive did we see towards edtech? Because I think we were very much used to a traditional education system. We have been products of that. You and I, we've always gone to the class. Right. We've learned. System worked.
System worked.
System worked.
Yes.
And maybe because the system worked, people were reluctant to adopt new trends like edtech.
That's
but
right.
Pandemic left us with no choice. What kind of a drive did you see in Sri Lanka towards edtech?
Right. So, just taking a step back, Tarindu, even the most senior educators in the world, leaving alone Sri Lanka, would not have been able to predict what was going to happen in March 2020.
Correct.
Right? Or the magnitude of it, or how long schools are going to be closed. Right? I'm not an expert on the pandemic, but still there's a debate even before I came with my team. Are we headed towards a third wave, or are we going more towards the post-pandemic era? I don't know.
Correct.
Right? So this is, we just have to adapt to it. So this is where the point that I made earlier, Tarindu, of, you know, how our educators in Sri Lanka, while facing, you know, magnanimous challenges, you know, just ensured from the perspective of our children, students' education, that the disruption was mitigated. Obviously,
correct,
we learned on the job.
Yes.
I mean, the educators, I want to give the credit to them, not to us. I mean, not to me, right? So there were quite a few challenges, right? You can't move away from that. So for example, as I told earlier, some of these platforms were way too sophisticated, right? It required a certain level of technology savviness. Number two, they required a high-end sophisticated device, which was expensive.
Correct.
And the cost of broadband or the cost of data.
Yes.
Right. So 1 year on, I think we have come a long way, Tarindu.
And we've done a good job.
We've done a good job in the sense, number one, I mean, you look at the technology savviness of our both the teachers and the students have gone up. Number two, I mean, some of the smarter companies have figured out ways to come up with lighter versions. Yes. And the last thing that I want to tell you is that, I mean, thanks to our the mobile companies, they've came up with concessionary data packages
for education.
Something that on average would cost anywhere between 30 to 40 rupees a GB. I mean, they managed to give it out for less than 7 rupees a GB.
Coming up on the other side of this break, what policies do we need from a government level in order to make edtech a success even more in Sri Lanka? Let's find out that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. The focus today is on the edtech market, the transformation it faced due to the pandemic, and especially in Sri Lanka. What policy decisions do we need to make this something not just a fad, but something that sticks and continues to deliver the long-term benefits to the student population of this nation? And joining me for this discussion is a veteran in the edtech sector, who is none other than Chaminda Silva. Chaminda, let's talk about from an infrastructure perspective. Now, the market reaction first, I would like to come to that first. The market reaction in Sri Lanka towards edtech, and like I said, we know we have been a very conservative education sector, but then the pandemic pushed us to adopt it. Now, people were willing to adopt. Then comes the question whether the infrastructure was ready. Yes, you very correctly said we saw so many solutions being offered by the mobile tech firms, etc. But once again, let me ask this question. Was our tech infrastructure ready for edtech adoption in Sri Lanka at the scale the pandemic forced us to adopt it and adapt to?
I think you used the correct words, forced us to adapt. Right?
There was no choice.
Forced adaptation, right? Okay, I'll first talk a little bit about the macro infrastructure or the statistics. So, if we look at our mobile penetration, it's at 130% plus,
correct,
which is, I mean, compared to some of our peers in the developing nations, we are in a reasonably good position. There's 28 million mobile connections out there in a country which has 22 million people. Then 50% of the people have a smartphone. Then from a broadband usage perspective, about 80% we have people using broadband. When you include both the mobile part of it as well as the fixed line part of it. So, that kind of laid a foundation for us to something that we could work with, right?
We were on a good wicket at the start, or maybe
okay,
we had a decent start.
Something workable.
Something workable.
I mean, workable, right? I mean,
we use this word shape.
Shape.
the typical Sri Lankan word for
shape.
something.
Shape,
okay,
shape. That's right. So I think I partially answered parts of this question earlier as well. But then again, you know, there was so many challenges, right? Now, if I'm to, I spoke about challenges earlier, but let me just focus in Tarandu on the infrastructure challenges.
Correct,
right?
correct.
Again, just
but there were some concerns that some students were not having proper internet access, and that people in the rural areas were struggling, and these concerns were raised online as well.
That's right. I mean, not just in the rural areas, even in Colombo, right? Access to a smart device, a computer, it was not cheap, right? And as I told you earlier, the second part was the data part of it, the cost of data. And the third thing is, you're spot on, the more you went away from the city center, right, the more you went into the rural areas, Tarindu.
Which is 80% of the country.
That's right, right. These challenges completely magnified. But to a certain extent, I think we learn to, as a country, as a education community, schooling community, we learn to work around it, right. You take, let's start with the point that you made, 80% of the community being rural, right. They may not have access to a device, but they have access to TV. So when it came to education content, right, they managed to get through to it by a television or a radio.
Correct.
So, and I spoke about the whole factor about how the data cost on these concessionary rates, you know, it came down. So I think what I like to say is that, you know, 1 year on, we are much more prepared. As a country, we have laid the foundation. There's a lot more work to be done, but you know, I strongly believe that, you know, the educators need a pat in the back.
Okay, and you keep emphasizing that.
That because it was the users who you know, made it successful, or in other words, who mitigated the impact of this.
And even the teachers, they could have easily put the blame on the technology, saying, no, this is not working,
That's
is
right.
not working, because these platforms are also somewhat not ready for so much of a large scale adoption at a country or a global level.
Yes.
But the teachers found a way through to somehow or other deliver and do their best. Chaminda, I want to ask you about the benefits of this mode of learning, because it looks like the edtech segment, or let's say learning through digital tools, or maybe a blended option where you learn some things in the class and some things digitally. Looks like this is here to stay, because for a foreseeable future we see possible lockdowns coming up, because we heard recently there was a the decision was made to reopen the universities, but then almost the very next day or 2 days later they brought the decision saying, no, we are going to postpone that because there seems to be a bit of a rise of some of the COVID cases. Now, so this is here to stay.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
what benefits does this EdTech segment bring to students and also to parents and also the educators and the institutes?
Let me break this down into different sections. First thing is for educators, it brings scalability, right? Less if it's used in its optimal avatar, the admin burden should come down. I mean, let me give you the most simplest example. A teacher would be able to reach out online to many more students than he or she would have been if technology was not there, right? And then this is where even geographically, you will not be contained to a small area.
I want to share a little personal experience
Sure.
with you. So, on a given Friday once, I found myself teaching Sri Lankan students from 8 to 10 and students in the Middle East from 10:30 to 12:30, just from the comfort of my room.
Wow.
And using one of these EdTech platforms.
Right. Right.
So, that's very good, scalability.
That's a fantastic example that you gave. So, from the school's perspective, the school administrator's perspective, because you've started using these platforms, Tarindu, now you will have stored data about the students, right? This will give the schools the opportunity through data analytics to identify the students' strengths, weaknesses, and accordingly come up with specific improvement plans, right? And to large extent, kind of carve out a academic career, academic path for a student, I mean, in order to position the person for a career. And from a parent's perspective, because of these technology platforms, parents are much more engaged with the school, right? I mean, you go back when we were in school, it was
the parents' day, the dreaded
only
day,
the dreaded day,
the judgment day,
which we sometimes may not have told our parents. Anyway,
Absolutely.
let's not talk about it, right? So
the notice never comes home.
right. So coming back to this, the parent has the option to get in touch with the school in a controlled manner.
Correct.
And the teacher also has the option, whenever he or she wants, to get in touch with the parent. So you don't have to wait 3 months.
Correct. And maybe not that the students are big fans of this,
right?
But earlier, as you very correctly said, it's only when the report card comes that you know your marks.
Yes.
Or sometimes the report card does not come home. At the same time,
right.
Now even how the students are performing, how the student performed last week at a particular test,
right?
How the student has performed now,
right?
Parents have access to that. And I saw some of these global EdTech platforms, the educator is able to actually come and give a live feedback
yes.
to the parent
yes.
in front of the student.
Yes.
Of course, it's a nightmare for some students, but
yes.
having said that, it's exactly the purpose of EdTech, isn't it? To make things more, let's say, easy to track.
Yes.
And if you can track and monitor,
yes.
you can take better corrective action.
Spot on, Tarindu. So just staying with that. So basically, I mean, just adding on to that, I mean, some of these, what I call triggers or automated messages, I mean, immediately goes to the parent. If your son or daughter is doing extremely well, the system picks it up and sends it. The school doesn't even get involved. Same way, if your scores are low, if your attendance is low, if you don't show up for certain practices, right? So the parent immediately gets a message. So the engagement level of the parents would go up or has gone up. That's what I should say. And at a very macro level, right? This is the part that I like the most. There's a positive correlationship between a country's digital adaptation and the economy, right? Or the GDP.
Okay.
Right. So when the digital adaptation is higher, the GDP chances are it will go up. So what better place to start than at schools?
Understood. And also, one of the best way to grow an economy is to spend on its education.
That's correct.
They said that you don't need a war to destroy a country, just destroy or bring down the level of education spending on that country, and the country will naturally crumble and collapse.
Correct.
So at the same time, I think if there are proper investments happening in the EdTech sector from a national perspective,
right.
It will definitely, as you very correctly said, contribute more to the education sector, because, I mean the economic sector
That's
of the country,
right.
Because we hear this complaint that Sri Lanka only spends about less than 3% of the budget or of the GDP on the education sector, which is appalling. Chaminda, I want to ask you about the features, the solutions. Is this EdTech solutions an answer to the the education inequality that we see in Sri Lanka? Because we all know that even today there is a huge effort by some of the schools outside Colombo after the scholarship exam or after O-levels to somehow come to a Colombo school. And then there are certain designated schools. Yes, there are some targeted schools in certain cities as well outside Colombo, but that rush, do well in one of those exams and get to a Colombo school, that rush is still there, that mindset is still there. But through Edtech, do we have an opportunity to ensure quality education for the entire country? And if that's to happen, the second part of my question and the final one to you is, what policies do we need at a government level to make Edtech a more successful factor in Sri Lanka? So,
taking your first part of the question, Tharindu, I think definitely Edtech will help democratize
education,
access to quality education.
Understood.
Right.
To bridge that gap.
To bridge that gap. I think in Sri Lanka has done a good job in terms of perhaps access to education. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, which I'll talk about in a bit, on the access to quality education. I mean, this is why through the scholarship everyone wants to come to perhaps Colombo schools or the larger cities, the metros. So coming back to this, as when we started and when you asked me for the definition of Edtech, I mentioned that ideally Edtech should be driving inclusivity to all communities, including the underprivileged communities. Correct. So this is something that I hope we'll see as we go.
Because education is a basic right of every citizen in this country.
Yes, yes, right. And now talking about the opportunities, as you mentioned, right. So let's talk about first what I call a cross-border, cross-district blended school.
Okay. Wow.
Right. Okay. So this is where I think we've done enough work as a country to lay the foundation for these schools in the future, where the geographical boundaries or the restrictions that are in place, perhaps we can to an extent overcome that by going into these type of schools. I mean, the schooling model that I'm talking to you about. What I envisage is that a student in, for example, in a rural area in say Kurunegala or in Jaffna would be able to attend a science class conducted by a teacher in a top tier school in Colombo.
Understood.
Right. While for the physical schooling, perhaps he or she can continue with the schooling in her or his locality.
Got it. Right. Chaminda, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to press on this. For these things to happen, what government policies do we need to make Edtech successful in Sri Lanka? From a government perspective, what are the policy decisions you see that the government needs to take?
Right. I'll just answer that in a slightly different way from an opportunities perspective.
All right. Okay.
So the second part to this, Tharindu, is that the soft skills development, as I think as a country, maybe perhaps at a policy level as well.
Yes.
While I mean, throughout the discussion, I emphasized what a good job our schools have done from a adapting a technology perspective. But I mean, it's a daunting task for someone to conduct one of these classes compared to having this face-to-face conversation.
Understood.
Right. I mean, it's a very easy conversation for me to have with you here compared to when you call me.
Correct.
Because
Correct.
we don't have. I mean, you're not in person.
Correct.
The same way, I believe that more investment perhaps should go into this soft skills development, because the skill set requirement is perhaps different.
More like now the soft digital skills.
I didn't think of it, but that's a very nice way of putting it. And on the data side, the government, the authorities and the mobile companies have started this Government Sannivedana program, which is to drive broadband adaptation or coverage, 100% coverage.
Correct.
They've started with Ratnapura.
Yes.
So I think if that can be, once that's implemented, just imagine everybody. You spoke about equality.
Yes.
You spoke about, I spoke about, driving inclusivity.
Correct. The whole digital inclusion aspect. Yes.
This becomes a, extremely massive part to this. The other last part that I want to talk about is the investments that's to be made in schools, right? Whatever investments that needs to be made, I started, when I started the discussion, I mentioned that, it has to be based on the requirements of the community, the schooling community. What's been used in K-12 in the US may not be useful for us.
Correct.
Right? Number one. And then number two, whatever's been invested today, Tharindu, we have to ensure that technology, that asset is reusable way beyond the pandemic as well. The reason for me to say this is that EdTech, particularly in developing nations, we are just scratching the surface, right? Right now, what has happened is that we have, as a country, we have adapted to we were forced to adapt to this situation. So perhaps what we were mainly doing, the majority, 90% of it was perhaps what I call emergency learning technology.
Understood.
Right? Understood. But now that we've laid the foundation for this, right? I think the real ROI for the schools, the educators, the country, Tharindu, would come post the pandemic. Now, I don't know when that would be.
Understood.
Because then we will be able to look beyond these emergencies, that we have currently.
Chaminda, just on a final note to add here, you mentioned about ROI. Now, a business will also look at, okay, if an investor is looking, should I enter into EdTech or not? Now, there are opportunities even within EdTech, rather than just looking at it saying EdTech, because some recent research reports I went through, I saw how, for example, yes, teaching is one aspect of EdTech, but then you also get things like test preparation, and these are apparently those segments where the parents are willing to spend more and to get their children trained on some of the tests. So, for an investor, there are certain pockets in EdTech that are highly lucrative. Do you agree?
Completely. I think I'm going to be careful here on what I mentioned, but content is a big thing.
Yes.
In the current avatar, content is big, right? Then the data analytics part.
Yes.
The platforms who can conduct data analytics and help out
the
students and the school.
Correct.
To improve, and
Understood.
now some of the platforms have moved into teacher performance analytics as well.
Wow.
Digital communication is big,
Yes.
and then, as I mentioned earlier, a subsector of fintech has also now entered into
correct.
EdTech.
So, like you said, we are still at the tip of the iceberg, but there is so much opportunity here. And thank you very much, Chaminda, for having joined us and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Tharindu. The pleasure is all mine.
What exactly does it mean to adopt EdTech into an education institute? And we will speak to a person with the practical experience of having overseen that process. Stay tuned. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus is on the EdTech sector. What exactly has this been about, the potential of it, and we are about to find out the practical experience of adopting EdTech into an educational institute, what to avoid, what you need to be careful about, and what exactly works. And to talk about this, we have a veteran in the education, management and administration sector joining us for this segment, who is Chintaka Wijayaratna. Chintaka, welcome to Bisnomics.
Hello Tharindu, pleased to be here.
Chintaka, now your experience, now you are going to talk to us from more like the management and the administrative perspective. We heard in the earlier segments about the technological aspect, but one would ask, technology is one thing, but integrating technology and making it work is another thing. So,
sure.
You had this experience of almost overnight having to go onto a completely EdTech. I'm sure that was a very exciting and maybe to a certain extent frightful experience as well. But from a students and parents perspective, when you all of a sudden went 100% digital, what was the reaction? Share with us that story.
Okay Tharindu, I'll bring in a different perspective to that. I would not agree with the concept of overnight change. However, as an institution, we are into professional education. So, this digitalization or the EdTech part, though we did not connect it fully, we had our plans and investments put in since 2017 to get the students really working on EdTech concepts. How we did that, let me explain you in a bit. See, we are into physical lecturing mode as any other institution or a university, because we are a business school into professional education. So, our focus was to coach students in physical lectures. But 2017 we took that real decision to bring in the EdTech part in some way connecting to the students. So, what we did at that point was to make it as a complementing factor to make it available for them to have different benefits out of it. So, I mean 2020 March all of us had to change overnight.
Correct.
And then I think that's a challenging mode.
Correct.
But at that point, since we had this investment on a particular learning management system, I think the overnight change was possible.
More smoother, a smoother transition.
Smoother, yeah. Still, Charindu, I would say there were many challenges because see, now somebody coming into a lecture hall, overnight you can't say, okay, the lectures are not there.
Join from home.
Join from home, okay. What would it require? I mean, we all know the IT infrastructure is not so, solid in the country. Not that everyone has the infrastructure to support it.
And maybe also from a mindset perspective, they are not mentally ready also to do that, isn't
Absolutely.
it?
So, I think I would put it as a challenge, the overnight challenge that we had to face, I think more difficultly.
Correct.
And okay, what we did actually is to get the students some time to understand the concept. We gave them some time to understand the concept. I would say a week's time, and then there were so many programs that we had in communicating to the students, okay, this is what's going to be. And more importantly, I would say we were really focusing on the structure of what's going to happen in the next 3 months, because see, now we never expected a pandemic. Though we were expecting, okay, maybe 1 week, 2 weeks,
Correct.
it may go on, go not.
And the lockdowns or the curfews were also for
Exactly.
1 week until next Tuesday.
Exactly.
Of
So
course, Monday it gets extended.
Monday it gets extended. So, in that sense, what we did is to communicate and educate our students, okay, this is the plan. This is how you are going to work it out. You have already got the system in. It's just that the mode will change completely. So, you asked about the reaction of the students and the parents. From my experience, Tharindu, I must tell you the reaction was positive, because I'm sure all of us discussed this even before, you don't have an option now.
Correct.
So, this is the only option. So, either you adopt or you go out of the system.
Understood.
So, I think that way we were able to convince the student to be positive with this move, and then going on with it of course had its own challenges. And parents, of course, I would say even they were positive, but they had different other challenges. Correct. Such as, okay, how do you provide this facility, how do you provide the infrastructure, how do you provide the internet connections,
Correct.
all that.
Understood.
But I must say it was a smoother move after about a month's period, not an overnight move.
Chintaka, let's talk about from the lecturer's perspective, because you interact with the lecturers also on a very frequent basis. From your understanding, we go from being taught in the class to 100% virtual. To make it effective, to make this mode of learning effective in a country like Sri Lanka, where we are all used to the traditional education, come to the classroom and learn, to make this virtual learning more effective, what are the changes that lecturers need to do in your perspective? Let me put it another way. When teaching via LMS, a learning management system, to make it effective, what should the lecturers do?
Okay. Let me again bring you a concept of online learning versus learning through a learning management system, because I think nowadays most of the people talk about online learning.
Correct.
But that's drilled down to a very small segment where the capabilities are slightly less. But when you talk about a learning management system, we focus on more content and then more organized, as you said, and then the feedback and the performances can be monitored. So, a lot of analytics are there within it. So, coming on to how we face that challenge in order to get the lecturers to teach online is again to go with the structure. Say for example, I will take one example from our own system. We have 3 segments on it. The first segment would be the content part, heavily loaded with the material and certain explanations of those material coming in as recorded video sessions, etc. And then summing up, maybe you can call it mind maps, and then you have the test your knowledge part. So, that is the first segment of our learning management system. And then the first thing that we did is to work with the lecturers, because here it is a collaborative approach. You cannot like dictate to a lecturer, okay, from this date do it online. Yeah. You can't do that. So it was more of a collaborative approach where the lecturers were discussing about how we are going to do that. And then we all agreed in a uniform agreement, okay, we have to cover the learning outcomes. So in a particular subject, the component was drilled down to different learning outcomes, and for the learning outcomes, we structured the course. And then you may ask me the question, okay, in a typical lecture hall environment, you spend about 4 or 5 hours. And online, do you expect the child to be there, I mean, in front of the computer for 4 to 5 hours? The answer is no. Unfortunately, still in our country, I still see certain teachers, have not come out of that mindset.
They're trying to teach for 4 hours.
Teach for 4 hours doesn't really work in our experience, Taridu. I mean, to be very honest and blunt, right? And what we did is, how do we manage this 4-hour lesson in a particular time frame where the student would be comfortable?
Correct.
So then we came into this segmentation on the LMS. So you have the first phase talking about certain material and the content, as I explained you, which will come to the student slightly in advance. Say for example, like you're the lecturer, you have a lecture schedule, because I mean our students are typically used to have the lecture timetables. You come to a lecture on a particular timetable, and I'm sure like you yourself is a lecturer in different institutions. So, I mean, coming there on time is a major aspect.
Correct.
So, we need to fulfill that aspect as well. So, you start the class, go for 2 hours, but prior to that, you have some prior learning, the homework part that you should do.
You can come to the class more prepared.
Absolutely. So, that way we reduce the time spent on the live session. The third segment of our LMS is the exam engine, where you allow them to practice questions. Test preps, absolutely. So, I think these 3 segments really helped us in collaborative discussions with our lecturers to get into a good arrangement and an engagement.
For sure, Chintaka.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about a big doubt that a lot of people are having, the quality of the students who are qualifying via these platforms. So, not only is the learning happening online, now even the exams are happening online. We see online assignment basis, and there are even methods like they say proctoring, where you take certain MCQ and objective type questions from home. Earlier you used to go to an exam center and do it, now you do it from home. What guarantee is there that the students are actually taking the right approach and that they have actually been properly tested? Because Chintaka, let's be very open here. There is a concern that there is a very high probability of fraud taking place. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll answer you from the last question. Yes, if you are not genuine enough to face a particular assessment, who is going to lose?
The student will lose it.
Student would lose, right? So, that concept, that mindset will have to be set by the tutors and the administrators. That's number one. And then you were talking about remotely proctored exams. I mean, the professional qualification which we represent, of course, was first institution to go in the remotely proctored examinations in the professional education sector. So, we started back in last year May, the remotely proctored exams. But in that, you have brought in sophisticated systems for the student to bring in lot of ethical conduct within the exam.
Understood.
So, remotely proctoring means like you're virtually invigilated. You're virtually invigilated. So, even if you move your eye and then look at a book, the invigilator would note it and then maybe stop your exam. So, coming on to your first question, okay, how do you encourage the results perspective? Okay, I would say like in an online platform, rather than having a physical lecture, there are so many benefits.
Understood.
What are those benefits? From our perspective, I could like very well confirm you, the students could like retrieve those recorded sessions over and over. I mean, in a typical classroom environment, unless you record it, you cannot do that. And then test your knowledge part, the prep sessions, really helps the students. And then third thing which I would say is, there's no particular timing. I mean, the youngsters these days, they're used to get your things done at their own pace.
Correct.
So that has actually helped them to better be prepared for these examinations. I could go to one example again from our perspective. Now, 2020, from the professional education segment that I represent, our institution, the institution that I run, actually got awarded for the Best Pass Rate Excellence Award. That's in 2020. That's during the pandemic.
So, first of all, congratulations. And
thank you very much.
Secondly, the results of adopting EdTech, I think with a proper plan, as you were very correctly saying.
I think
the technology is there, but you need to be organized and you need to have a right plan.
Yes,
so it's working, but it's also a work in progress. You need to discover what works for you and integrate it properly.
Correct.
Chintaka, on a final note, very quickly, the top 3 do's and the top 3 don'ts when trying to bring in EdTech into an institute, from your experience.
Okay. Top 3 do's I'll start with. First, you'll have to identify what your segment needs. The proper customization has to go into whatever the learning management system that you're going to adopt your course into, right? And then it has to come in a particular structure. Now, as I explained in a very brief manner, I think there's a lot of planning that we have gone through in terms of getting this. I would say about 8 months planning, because I said we started back in 2017 our LMS system, right? So the structure will have to be well organized, and then that has to be properly planned. Third thing, monitoring performance and giving feedback, which is a very, very important feature which should be there in your learning management system. That can be for the lecturers, which is the tutors, as well as the students.
Understood.
Because they'll have to monitor their performance, they'll have to look through what they have done,
correct,
and then correct themselves. And for that, you have to do, certain analytics from the back end to support that.
Correct.
So those are the 3 do's if you want me to prioritize. Sure. The 3 don'ts. First thing, you have to come out of the myth of doing something online using a particular platform. I'm not trying to use names here.
Yes.
But most of the teachers nowadays think you're going in front of a camera, you're delivering the lecture as you typically did in the classroom.
Correct.
Works online.
It doesn't.
So you have to come out of that myth. That's number 1. Number 2, if you think EdTech would not be the future, you need to come out of that myth as well.
A big myth you need to bust.
Of course. And the third thing is, of course, you need to cater to your customer with their requirements, not trying to overdo things.
Understood.
And to manage within your perspective. I think those are the 3 things that I would say as don'ts in a potential setup of a learning management operation.
Very insightful and indeed very thoughtful there, Chintaka. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and wish you good luck with all the future endeavors in adopting EdTech and delivering quality education to the professionals of this country. Wish you and the team all the best.
Thank you very much, Tarindu. All the best.
Our focus today was on the EdTech sector. What does actually adopting EdTech into an organization truly mean? And what are the do's, what are the don'ts, what technologies are there to enable this, and most importantly, how can we make sure that using EdTech we can deliver quality, effective education to the students of Sri Lanka. After all, they are our tomorrow, they are the future of this nation. Smart EdTech adoption will ensure that we have a quality student base graduating from their respective exams and contributing more effectively to the Sri Lankan economy. And with that, we wrap up today's episode of Bisnomics. This is your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'll see you with the next episode. Have a profitable week ahead.